The air in Charleston on that humid May morning in 1862 hung thick and suffocating, not only with the scent of salt marsh and distant jasmine, but with the unmistakable tension of a city under siege. The war was barely a year old, yet it had already carved deep lines of worry into every face. Military patrols tightened their grip, and the once bustling harbor had been transformed into a grim Confederate stronghold. Cannons watched the water. Fort Sumter loomed like a warning. Nothing moved without permission. And yet something impossible had happened. The CSS Planter was gone, not sunk by Union fire, not captured in battle, but stolen, and not by a daring Union raid, but by a man legally considered property. An enslaved man had taken the Planter, a sleek Confederate sidewheel steamer, piloted it through Charleston's heavily fortified harbor, past the guns of Fort Sumter using Confederate signal codes, and delivered it directly into the waiting arms of the Union blockade. When the news finally broke, after frantic denials and stunned silence, it spread like wildfire. Confederate officers erupted in outrage and humiliation, while among the enslaved population, a dangerous new emotion flickered to life: hope. How could a man with no formal education, no military rank, no legal identity, navigate a warship through a maze of mines, batteries, and vigilant sentries, using the very signals meant to imprison him? It shattered every assumption. It mocked the foundations of slavery. And worst of all, it revealed a terrifying vulnerability at the very heart of the Confederacy. The Planter itself was a marvel of its time, a 150-foot wooden steamer, twin paddle wheels churning dark harbor water with surprising speed. Its dull gray hull bore the scars of endless supply runs. Brass fittings, once polished with pride, were dulled by salt air and neglect. Normally her deck bristled with weapons, a pivot gun, a heavy howitzer, symbols of Confederate power. But that morning the rising sun illuminated only emptiness. Where the ship should have been, there was nothing, just the lingering smell of coal smoke and the unsettling silence of absence. The harbor, usually alive with creaking ropes, shouted orders, and hammer blows from the shipyards, erupted into chaos. Officers shouted, horses galloped across cobblestones. A steam whistle wailed like a funeral cry. Patrol boats tore through the water in desperate pursuit, but it was already too late. The air, thick with tar, brine, and distant gunpowder, seemed to vibrate with a single unspoken truth. Something fundamental had just broken. Confederate officers paced the docks, their crisp gray uniforms suddenly looking fragile, fury mixed with disbelief, and beneath it all, shame. This is not just a story of escape. It is a story of intelligence, courage, and the cracking of chains thought unbreakable. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten moments like this, where history turns in silence and defiance, subscribe to Vintage Chains, hit the notification bell, and comment below with the country you're watching from. History still whispers, and here we listen. Major General John C. Peton, the stern commander of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, was said to be apoplectic, his booming voice echoing across the wharves. The very idea that one of their own, a man they considered Chat, could outwit their entire military apparatus was an insult of the highest order. It wasn't just a ship lost, it was a blow to their very ideology, a crack in the foundation of their perceived superiority. The social hierarchy of Charleston, usually as rigid and unyielding as the iron gates of its grand mansions, felt a tremor. The white elite, accustomed to their lives of leisure and absolute authority, suddenly found themselves questioning the very nature of their control. The enslaved population, usually moving through the city with downcast eyes and hushed voices, now exchanged furtive glances, a spark of something new in their gaze, a dangerous, exhilarating hope. But beyond the obvious audacity of the act, beyond the sheer courage of Robert Smalls, there were whispers, faint and unsettling, that began to circulate in the shadowed corners of the city, whispers of an unseen hand, a guiding force, a series of improbable coincidences that seemed to pave the way for the planters. Escape. How could the centuries have been so lax? Why were the signal codes so easily accessible, and what of the mysterious Confederate officer, Lieutenant Abernathy, who had been aboard the Planter just days before its disappearance, and whose own sudden absence from the city seemed almost too convenient? The official narrative would be one of a daring slave, a brilliant act of defiance, and it was, undeniably, But for those who looked closer, who listened to the silences between the shouted orders and the frantic searches, a more complex, more unsettling truth began to emerge, a truth that suggested the impossible voyage of the planter was not merely an act of individual heroism, but perhaps a meticulously orchestrated maneuver in a much larger, darker game of shadows and deception. The question wasn't just how Robert Smalls stole the ship, but who might have wanted him to, and why. The salt spray on the docks, usually invigorating, now felt like a cold sweat on the brow of Charleston. The city, once so confident in its impregnable defenses, now felt a chill wind of doubt blowing through its streets, carrying with it the unsettling scent of betrayal and the lingering question of what other secrets lay hidden beneath the placid surface of its harbor. The impossible had happened, and the reverberations would echo far beyond the immediate shock, hinting at a deeper, more intricate web of intrigue that had yet to fully unravel. Robert Smalls was born into bondage in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839, a world away from the grand, bustling port of Charleston, yet inextricably linked by the cruel threads of the peculiar institution. His mother, Lydia, was enslaved by Henry McKee, a prominent planter, and Robert's early years were spent amidst the sprawling fields and tidal creeks of the Low Country. The air there was thick with the scent of plough mud and salt marsh, a constant earthy perfume that would forever cling to his memory. He learned to navigate the intricate waterways of the Beaufort River long before he ever set foot on a city street, his small hands expertly guiding a skiff through the reeds, his eyes keenly observing the shifting tides and the distant flight of egrets. Lydia, a woman of quiet strength and profound wisdom, instilled in her son a deep sense of self-worth and an unyielding spirit despite the crushing realities of their existence. She taught him to read the subtle signs of nature, to listen more than he spoke, and to observe everything. "The world speaks in whispers, Robert," she would often say, her voice soft but firm, "and those who listen closely hear its secrets." These early lessons delivered under the vast star-dusted canopy of the Carolina sky would prove more valuable than any formal education. His father, though never officially acknowledged, was widely believed to be Henry McKee himself, a common and tragic reality of the time. This lineage, while offering no legal protection, perhaps afforded Robert a certain unspoken, almost imperceptible degree of leniency in his early years, a slight buffer against the harshest cruelties of the system. He was not spared the sight of suffering, however. He witnessed the brutal realities of slavery firsthand, the lash, the forced separations, the quiet despair in the eyes of his people. These images burned into his young mind, fueling a unarticulated yearning for something more, something free. When Robert was 12, McKee, recognizing the boy's sharp intellect and restless energy, sent him to Charleston to be hired out. It was a common practice, a way for owners to profit from their human property while exposing them to trades and skills that might increase their value. The move was a seismic shift for young Robert. Beaufort was rural, its rhythms dictated by the tides and the planting seasons. Charleston was a roaring beast of a city, a cacophony of sounds, a kaleidoscope of sights. The docks of Charleston became his new classroom, a sprawling, chaotic university of maritime life. The air here was a potent cocktail of tar, brine, spices from distant lands, and the ever-present stench of human waste. E worked as a lamplighter, a rigger, a sailmaker, a stevedore, any job that would bring him closer to the water, closer to the ships. He absorbed every detail, the intricate knot-tying of the sailors, the precise movements of the pilots guiding vessels through the treacherous harbor, the language of the flags, the rhythm of the tides, the deep-seated knowledge of the bravery currents that could make or break a voyage. He was a sponge, soaking up information, his mind a meticulous ledger of observations. He learned the names of every ship, the faces of every captain, the routines of every dock worker. He could distinguish the distant clang of a ship's bell from the chime of a church clock, the specific creak of a schooner's mast from the groan of a paddle-wheeler. He learned to read the weather, not just from the sky, but from the subtle shifts in the wind, the feel of the humidity on his skin. It was on these docks that he met Hannah Jones, a chambermaid, a woman of quiet grace and fierce intelligence. Their courtship was a clandestine affair, stolen moments in shadowed alleys, whispered conversations under the cloak of night. They found solace and strength in each other, a shared dream of a life beyond the confines of their bondage. They married in 1856, their union a defiant act of hope in a world that denied them basic human rights. Their children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr., became the very heart of his existence, the living embodiment of his desperate need for freedom. Every day as he watched them play, their innocent laughter echoing through the cramped quarters they shared, the weight of his responsibility grew heavier, the yearning for liberation more urgent. The social world of enslaved people in Charleston was a vibrant, resilient tapestry woven with threads of shared suffering and enduring hope. They formed their own communities, their own churches, their own networks of communication. Whispers of resistance, of escape, of the distant promise of the North traveled through these channels, carried on the wind like dandelion seeds. Robert was a part of this network, a quiet observer, but a trusted one. He saw the subtle acts of defiance, the hidden strength, the unwavering faith that one day their chains would be broken. He spent countless hours on the decks of various vessels, from small fishing boats to grand merchant ships, learning the intricacies of their operation. He became a skilled rigger, then a wheelman, his hands growing accustomed to the feel of the helm, his body attuned to the subtle vibrations of the engine. He knew the harbor like the back of his hand, every shaw, every channel, every hidden marker. He could navigate it blindfolded, guided by instinct and an encyclopedic knowledge of its depths and currents. As the drums of war began to beat louder, Robert observed the Confederate military operations with a keen, almost detached interest. He saw the fortifications being strengthened, the new guns being mounted, the constant drills. He watched the troop movements, the supply ships coming and going, the intricate dance of a city preparing for battle. He was a ghost in their midst, an invisible man, seeing everything, hearing everything, yet perceived as seeing and hearing nothing of consequence. In the quiet solitude of his mind, as he steered ships through the moonlit harbor or watched his children in sleep, Robert wrestled with his fate. The dreams of freedom, once a distant, shimmering mirage, now began to coalesce into a tangible, desperate plan. He knew the risks, the unimaginable consequences of failure, but the alternative, a life of perpetual bondage for himself and his children, was a fate far more terrifying than any gallows. The city, the harbor, the ships, the very air he breathed, all were instruments of his oppression, but he was slowly, meticulously learning to turn them into instruments of his liberation. If you're finding this story as fascinating as the historical mysteries it uncovers, consider subscribing to stay updated on more untold American stories. The outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 shattered the fragile peace of Charleston, replacing it with a feverish, almost intoxicating sense of purpose among the white population and a deepening dread among the enslaved. The bombardment of Fort Sumter, a spectacle of fire and smoke that lit up the pre-dawn sky, was met with cheers and celebrations in the city. But for Robert, watching from the docks, it was a chilling harbinger of the violence to come. The war, initially seen as a swift, decisive victory for the Confederacy, quickly settled into a grinding, brutal reality. The city, once a vibrant hub of commerce, transformed into a military stronghold. Its streets teeming with soldiers in gray, its harbor bristling with newly fortified batteries. Robert's skills as a wheelman honed over years of navigating the treacherous Charleston harbor became invaluable to the Confederate war effort. He was assigned to the CSS Planter, a vessel that had been converted from a cotton transport into an armed dispatch and transport boat. It was a crucial cog in the Confederate machine, fing troops, supplies, and dispatches between the various fortifications dotting the harbor and the coastal islands. For Robert, it was a bitter irony. His expertise, his very lifeblood, was now being used to strengthen the chains that bound him. The Planter was a sleek, fast vessel, its paddle wheels capable of cutting through the water with impressive speed. It was armed with a 32 lb pivot gun and a 24-pound howitzer, formidable weapons for a ship of its size. Robert spent countless hours at the helm, his hands gripping the polished wood, his eyes scanning the familiar waters. He learned every nuance of the ship, the groan of its engines, the precise amount of steam needed for a quick turn, the subtle vibrations that indicated a change in the current. He knew its strengths, its weaknesses, its every secret. The crew consisted of a mix of white officers and enslaved laborers. The officers, often young and full of the Confederacy's zealous pride, treated Robert and the other enslaved men with a mixture of casual indifference and condescending authority. They saw them as extensions of the ship itself, tools to be used, not men to be acknowledged. This perception, however, was Robert's greatest advantage. He was invisible, a shadow moving through their world, observing, listening, absorbing every detail. He learned the routines of the Confederate officers with meticulous precision. He knew when Captain Relier would retire to his cabin for his evening whiskey, when Lieutenant Riley would take his customary smoke on the stern, when the sentries would change shifts. He memorized their conversations, their boasts, their complaints, piecing together a mosaic of their habits and vulnerabilities. More critically, he learned the intricate system of Confederate signal codes, the flags, the whistles, the specific sequences that allowed vessels to pass through the heavily guarded harbor checkpoints. He watched, he listened, he committed every detail to memory, a silent, living cipher. It was during this period that Lieutenant Abernathy joined the planter's complement, a man who had become a central enigmatic figure in the unfolding drama. Abernathy was different from the other officers. He was older, perhaps in his late 30s, with a lean, almost gaunt frame and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual, unsettling glint of amusement even in the gravest situations. His uniform, though always immaculate, seemed to hang on him with a certain casualness, as if he wore it out of necessity rather than conviction. He spoke with a clipped, almost academic precision, and often seemed lost in thought, his gaze drifting over the horizon, as if searching for something beyond the immediate confines of tea. He wore. Abernathy had a peculiar habit of engaging Robert in seemingly innocuous conversations, asking about the tides, the history of the harbor, the best fishing spots. Other officers would bark orders. Abernathy would inquire. He would sometimes linger on deck after the others had retired, watching Robert at the wheel, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He never spoke of the war with the same fervent patriotism as his peers, often offering cynical, almost philosophical observations about the futility of conflict. Robert, ever the keen observer, noted these anomalies. He sensed a depth, a complexity in Abernathy that set him apart, a man who seemed to be playing a role rather than simply living it. The atmosphere in wartime Charleston was thick with paranoia and suspicion. Rumors of Union spies abounded, and the Confederate authorities were ruthless in their pursuit of anyone suspected of disloyalty. Enslaved people, always under scrutiny, found themselves under even greater surveillance. Yet Abernathy seemed to move through this climate with an almost reckless disregard for caution. He would sometimes leave sensitive documents carelessly on his desk or engage in hushed conversations with unknown figures in dimly lit taverns. Conversations that Robert, with his acute hearing and practiced invisibility, sometimes caught snippets of words like rendezvous, intelligence, and northern lines would float through the air, tantalizing and unsettling. Robert's internal conflict grew with each passing day. He was a man caught between two worlds, the world of his enslavers, which he served with outward obedience, and the hidden world of his dreams, where freedom beckoned. The planter, once a symbol of his bondage, began to transform in his mind. He saw it not as a Confederate warship, but as a vessel of liberation, a key to unlock the chains of his family. Abernathy's strange behavior, his subtle deviations from the expected Confederate norm, began to plant a seed of an idea in Robert's mind. Could this man, this enigmatic officer, be more than he seemed? Could his presence, his peculiar habits, be a sign, a subtle opening in the impenetrable wall of Confederate control? The thought was audacious, dangerous, but it sparked a flicker of hope, a foreshadowing of the audacious plan that would soon take root in Robert's determined heart. The war had begun, and with it, a silent personal battle for freedom was about to be waged, with the CSS Planter as its unlikely prize. The idea, audacious and terrifying, began as a whisper in the deepest recesses of Robert's mind, a desperate prayer born of years of quiet observation and simmering resentment. It wasn't a sudden flash of inspiration, but a slow, meticulous crystallization of countless hours spent at the helm of the Planter, watching the Confederate officers, memorizing their routines, and charting every inch of the treacherous Charleston harbor. The ship, once a symbol of his bondage, began to transform in his imagination into a vessel of liberation, a key to unlock the chains that bound his family. The plan, when it finally took shape, was breathtaking in its simplicity and horrifying in its risk. He would steal the planter, not just sail it away, but navigate it through the heavily fortified harbor past the formidable guns of Fort Sumter and deliver it along with his family and fellow enslaved crewmen to the Union blockade. The sheer audacity of it made his heart pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. Failure meant certain death, not just for him, but for everyone he loved. He began to recruit his crew with the utmost caution, approaching only those he trusted implicitly, men whose longing for freedom burned as fiercely as his own. There was Alfred Gradine, a fellow wheelman, whose quiet strength Robert had long admired. John Smalls, a relative whose steady hands and unwavering loyalty were beyond question, and others, Abraham Jackson, Gabriel Turno, Samuel Chisholm, all men who had endured the same indignities, shared the same dreams. Each conversation was a tightrope walk, a delicate dance between hope and despair. He spoke in hushed tones late at night in the cramped quarters below deck or during stolen moments on the deserted docks. "We can take her," Robert would whisper, his voice barely audible above the lapping of the waves against the hull. "The planter, we can take her to the Union." The initial reactions were a mixture of disbelief, terror, and a desperate, fragile hope. "Are you mad, Robert?" Alfred had gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "They'll hang us all." But Robert, his gaze unwavering, laid out his meticulous observations, his intimate knowledge of the ship, the harbor, the Confederate routines. He spoke of the precise timing, the specific signals, the vulnerabilities he had identified. Slowly, painstakingly, he chipped away at their fear, replacing it with a growing sense of possibility, a shared conviction that this impossible dream might just be within their grasp. Hannah, his wife, was his rock, his confidant, and his most formidable critic. He shared the plan with her first in the quiet intimacy of their small cabin, the children sleeping soundly beside them, her face usually serene, contorted with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. If you fail, he knew what she meant. The consequences were unimaginable. But then her eyes met his, and he saw the same unyielding spirit that had drawn him to her. "But if you succeed," she finished, a new light in her eyes, "we will be free." She became an active participant, helping him refine the logistics, reminding him of details he might have overlooked. Her practical mind a crucial counterpoint to his daring vision, she would gather the children, prepare them for the journey, keep them calm amidst the chaos. The logistics were daunting. They needed to gather their families, including the women and children, without arousing suspicion. They needed to ensure the ship was fully provisioned with coal and food. They needed to time their departure perfectly when the white officers were ashore, indulging in the city's nocturnal pleasures. And most critically, they needed to navigate the gauntlet of Charleston's formidable defenses. Charleston Harbor was a fortress. Fort Sumter, a grim sentinel, guarded the main channel, its massive guns capable of obliterating any vessel. Surrounding it were other batteries, Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, and a network of smaller, strategically placed gun emplacements. The waters themselves were laced with torpedoes, mines, and patrolled by Confederate gunboats. Every vessel entering or leaving the harbor had to pass through a series of checkpoints, exchanging precise signal codes to identify themselves. Robert had spent years observing these signals, committing them to memory. The specific flag combinations, the number of whistle blasts, the precise sequence required for safe passage. He knew them better than many of the officers themselves. And then there was Abernathy. The enigmatic lieutenant's behavior had become increasingly peculiar, almost as if he were an unwitting accomplice, or perhaps a deliberate one. Abernathy had a habit of forgetting to secure sensitive documents, leaving them casually on his desk in the pilot house, where Robert, while cleaning, could easily glance at them. He would sometimes engage Robert in conversations about the Harbo, R's defenses, asking seemingly innocent questions about the exact placement of buoys or the strength of the currents near Fort Sumter. He even on one occasion accidentally left a small leather-bound notebook containing a partial list of the day's signal codes in a place where Robert was sure to find it. Robert, ever cautious, initially dismissed these as mere carelessness, but as the pattern emerged, a chilling realization began to dawn on him. These weren't accidents. Abernathy's absences from the ship often coincided with crucial intelligence-gathering opportunities for Robert. His casual remarks about the officers' shore leave habits seemed almost too perfectly timed. Robert began to suspect that Abernathy was not merely careless, but deliberately subtly facilitating his access to information. Was Anathy a Union spy? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. If true, it meant Robert was not entirely alone in this impossible endeavor. But it also meant he was a pawn, a piece in a larger, more dangerous game. He observed Abernathy more closely, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes would sometimes linger on Robert with an unreadable expression, a flicker of something akin to complicity, or perhaps calculation. He saw Abernathy meet with a cloaked figure in a deserted alley. One moonless night their conversation hushed and urgent. He found a small, intricately folded piece of paper near Abernathy's bunk containing a series of seemingly random numbers and letters, a cipher perhaps. The psychological tension was immense. Robert carried the weight of his family's future, the lives of his fellow crewmen, and the terrifying secret of his plan. He moved through his days with an outward calm, but beneath the surface his mind raced, analyzing every detail, every potential pitfall. He practiced the signals in his mind, rehearsed the route, imagined every possible scenario. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was tempered by a burning resolve, a fierce determination to seize the freedom that was his birthright. The shadows of the past, the injustices endured, were now fueling the audacious plan that would either lead to glorious liberation or a brutal, ignominious end. This story gets even more complex from here. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history alike, helps us continue bringing these forgotten tales to light. As the day of the planned escape drew nearer, the peculiar behavior of Lieutenant Abernathy intensified, casting a long, unsettling shadow over Robert's meticulously crafted scheme. What had initially seemed like mere carelessness now took on the chilling precision of deliberate action, making Robert question not just Anathy's motives, but the very nature of his own agency. Was he truly the architect of his freedom, or merely a tool in a larger unseen game? Abernathy, usually a man of precise habits, began to exhibit increasingly erratic patterns. He would often be the last officer to leave the planter for shore leave, lingering on deck, sometimes engaging Robert in seemingly idle chatter about the weather or the ship's maintenance. But his eyes, Robert noticed, were always scanning, always observing, as if he were conducting his own silent inventory. On several occasions, Abernathy would forget to lock his cabin door, leaving it ajar just enough for Robert in the course of his duties to glimpse the contents within. Once Robert saw a map spread across Abernathy's desk, not a Confederate chart, but a detailed, almost hand-drawn rendering of the harbor's defenses with certain channels and buoys, marked in a way that seemed to highlight vulnerabilities. He quickly averted his gaze, but the image was seared into his memory. The coincidences, too, began to pile up, each one too perfect to be truly accidental. A crucial guard post on the main channel, usually manned by 2 vigilant soldiers, would inexplicably be reduced to a single, often drowsy sentry on nights when the planter was scheduled for a late-night supply run. A patrol boat, known for its rigorous inspections, would be unexpectedly diverted to a distant island on the very evenings Robert had been meticulously observing the signal changes. Once a key to the ship's armory, where the heavy pivot gun was secured, was found dangling from a hook near the pilot house. An oversight so egregious it bordered on the absurd. Robert, his heart pounding, quickly returned it to its proper place, but the message was clear. An opening had been presented. One evening, while cleaning the pilot house after Abernathy had disembarked, Robert discovered a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of official Confederate dispatches. It was not Abernathy's usual logbook. Its pages were filled with strange symbols, seemingly random numbers and cryptic phrases in a language Robert didn't recognize, though some words looked vaguely German or Dutch. He quickly memorized a few lines, his mind racing, before carefully replacing the journal exactly as he had found it. This was no ordinary officer's diary. It was a coded message, a secret communication. Robert's growing suspicion that forces beyond his immediate control were at play became a constant, knowing presence. He began to feel like a puppet, his strings subtly manipulated by an unseen hand. He watched Abernathy with renewed intensity, searching for any tell, any sign of his true allegiance. He noticed that Abernathy often carried a small silver flask from which he would occasionally take a sip, not of whiskey, but of something clear and odorless, and sometimes after these sips his eyes would seem to sharpen, his movements become more deliberate, as if a fog had lifted from his mind. One sweltering afternoon, while the planter was docked for repairs, Robert overheard a hushed conversation between Abernathy and a man he had never seen before, a civilian dressed in plain, dark clothes, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. They spoke in low tones, their words barely audible above the clang of hammers from the shipyard. Robert caught fragments. The package is secure. Timing is critical. The northern lines await. The civilian handed Abernathy a small, tightly rolled parchment, which Abernathy quickly tucked into his inner coat pocket. The exchange was swift, clandestine, and utterly damning. The layers of deception seemed to multiply with each passing day. Was Abernathy a Union spy deliberately aiding Robert to deliver the planter and its valuable intelligence to the North? Or was he a double agent playing a more complex game, perhaps even using Robert as a decoy for a larger, more sinister Confederate plot? The paranoia was suffocating. Robert found himself scrutinizing every face on the docks, every passing glance, wondering who else was involved, who else knew. He felt a chilling sense of being watched, of being part of a grand, dangerous theatrical production where he was both the star and an unwitting extra. He began to notice other mysterious characters in the periphery of Abernathy's movements, a nervous merchant always lingering near the docks when Abernathy was present, his eyes darting about. A quiet, unassuming lairess who seemed to deliver Abernathy's uniforms with unusual frequency, sometimes exchanging a quick, almost imperceptible nod with the lieutenant. These were not direct clues, but unsettling pieces of a puzzle that refused to fully form. The question haunted Robert. Was he being used as a pawn? The thought was bitter, a challenge to his pride and his deeply held desire for self-determination. Yet, if it meant freedom for his family, if it meant striking a blow against the system that enslaved them, could he afford to refuse the help, however tainted its source? The psychological tension was immense, a constant battle between his innate caution and his burning desire for liberty. He knew that the path to freedom was fraught with peril, but now it seemed it was also paved with shadows and secrets, a labyrinth of hidden agendas where the line between ally and manipulator was dangerously blurred. The planter was not just a ship, it was a chess piece, and Robert Smalls, the enslaved wheelman, was about to make a move that would reverberate through history, perhaps guided by a hand he could not fully comprehend. The night of May 13, 1862, descended upon Charleston like a heavy shroud, thick with humidity and the oppressive silence that often precedes a storm. For Robert Smalls, it was the night, the culmination of years of quiet observation, months of meticulous planning, and weeks of agonizing suspense. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the distant rhythmic lapping of the waves against the planter's hull. Every nerve ending was alive, tingling with a mixture of terror and an almost unbearable exhilaration. The white officers, including Captain Relier and Lieutenant Riley, had disembarked earlier that evening, heading into the city for a night of revelry, their minds far from the enslaved crew left aboard. This was the window, the narrow, perilous opening Robert had been waiting for. The air was still, heavy with the scent of jasmine from distant gardens, mingling with the acrid tang of cold smoke and the ever-present smell of the harbor. A sliver of moon, barely visible through the haze, offered little illumination, plunging the docks into a deceptive gloom. At precisely 3 a.m., Robert moved. His movements were fluid, practiced, each step deliberate. He roused the other enslaved crewmen, Alfred Gradine, John Smalls, Abraham Jackson, Gabriel Turno, Samuel Chisholm, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and grim determination. There was no need for words. Their shared glances conveyed the enormity of the moment. They knew the stakes. The most delicate part of the plan was next, bringing their families aboard. Hannah, with a strength that belied her quiet demeanor, had gathered the children, Elizabeth, Robert Jr., and the children of the other crewmen in a small, secluded shack near the docks. She had kept them calm, whispering stories of a new life, a free life, even as her own heart pounded with her mother's primal fear. Robert met them, his eyes searching Hannah's for reassurance, finding it in her unwavering gaze. He helped them board the planter silently, the children bundled tightly, their small forms almost swallowed by the vastness of the ship. Each child, each wife was a precious car. Go, a living testament to the desperate gamble they were taking. At 3:30 a.m., with everyone safely aboard and hidden below deck, Robert gave the order to cast off. The lines were untied with practiced ease. The gangplank retracted. The planters' engines, usually a roaring beast, now rumbled to life with a subdued, almost reverent hum. Robert took the wheel, his hands firm, his eyes fixed on the dark channel ahead. The ship began to glide silently away from the dock, a ghost slipping into the night. The first checkpoint was near the city's southern edge, a small battery manned by a handful of Confederate soldiers. Robert, standing tall at the helm, donned Captain Ralera's straw hat, a distinctive piece of headwear he had often observed the captain wearing. It was a bold, almost theatrical gesture, a psychological weapon. He mimicked Raleig's posture, his confident bearing, his very essence. As they approached, a sentry's voice cut through the darkness. "Halt! Identify yourselves, Robert." His voice, steady, projected a tone of casual authority. "CSS Planter, Captain Ralea on board, routine patrol." He then executed the precise sequence of whistle blasts and flag signals he had memorized, a series of short, sharp toots and the raising of specific pennants. The tension was excruciating, each second stretching into an eternity. He could feel the eyes of the sentries on him, their suspicion a palpable weight. Then a return signal, a single whistle blast, and a wave of the lantern. They were through. A collective silent sigh of relief swept through the crew. The next checkpoint was more formidable. Fort Johnson, a heavily armed battery further down the channel. Again, Robert donned the hat, adopted the captain's swagger, and executed the signals. The fort's guns, dark and menacing, loomed in the darkness. He could almost feel their cold gaze, a moment of agonizing silence. Then another return signal passed, but the true test, the ultimate gauntlet, lay ahead. Fort Sumter. Its massive brick walls rose from the water like a sleeping leviathan, its cannon muzzles gaping, ready to unleash hell. The psychological terror was almost unbearable. Robert could feel the sweat trickling down his back, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew that a single mistake, a single deviation from the precise signals, would mean instant annihilation. As the planter approached Sumter, Robert executed the most complex sequence of signals, a series of flag changes and whistle blasts that he had rehearsed countless times in his mind. He mimicked Captain Ryer's distinctive gait on the deck, his confident wave to the sentries. He could hear the distant shouts of the fort's guards, their voices carrying across the water. He held his breath, his entire being focused on the task, on the precise timing, on the perfect execution. The seconds stretched, each one a lifetime. Then a final agonizingly slow return signal from the fort. They were clear. A wave of profound, almost dizzying relief washed over Robert. They had done it. They had passed the impossible. The planter was now steaming towards the open sea, towards the Union blockade. Below deck, the families who had endured the terrifying passage in hushed silence began to stir, a quiet murmur of hope replacing their fear. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Robert ordered the Confederate flag lowered. In its place, a white bedsheet hastily procured by Hannah was hoisted to the masthead. It fluttered bravely in the morning breeze, a stark symbol of surrender and a desperate plea for sanctuary. The Union blockade ships, dark silhouettes against the brightening horizon, slowly came into view. The USS Onward, a formidable Union gunboat, was the first to spot the approaching steamer. Initially, they prepared for battle, mistaking the planter for an attacking Confederate vessel. But then they saw the white flag fluttering defiantly against the rising sun. They saw the figures on the deck, dark-skinned men, women, and children waving frantically. As the planter drew closer, the Union sailors on the Onward could make out the face of the man at the helm. He was black, dressed in a Confederate captain's uniform, a straw hat perched jauntily on his head. He steered the ship with an air of quiet triumph, his eyes shining with a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. The impossible had been achieved. Freedom, hard-won and terrifyingly close, was finally within reach. The journey had been a testament to his courage, his ingenuity, and perhaps to the subtle, unseen hand that had guided him through the shadows of that fateful night. We're approaching the most shocking revelations of this story. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next investigation into America's hidden past. The reception by the Union forces aboard the USS Onward was a mixture of stunned disbelief and cautious awe. Captain Frederick C. Finney, commander of the Onward, initially ordered his gunners to prepare for an attack, convinced the approaching planter was a Confederate ruse. But the sight of the white flag and then the faces of the enslaved men, women, and children on deck quickly dispelled his suspicions. When Robert Smalls, still wearing Captain Relia's straw hat, expertly brought the planter alongside the Onward, a hush fell over the Union crew. It was an unprecedented act, a feat of daring that defied all expectations. Robert, stepping onto the deck of the Onward, was immediately surrounded. He spoke with a calm, clear voice, recounting the details of their escape, the route they had taken, the signals he had used, but it was the intelligence he provided that truly electrified the Union command. He described the precise locations of Confederate mines in the harbor, the exact layout of the fortifications, the strength of the garrisons, and most critically, the current Confederate signal codes. The planter itself, with its pivot, gun and howitzer, was a valuable prize, but the intelligence Robert carried in his mind was priceless. He was immediately debriefed by a team of Union intelligence officers, their initial skepticism quickly replaced by a growing sense of wonder. Robert recounted every detail, every observation, every subtle nuance of Confederate operations he had absorbed over the years. He spoke of the officers' routines, the ship's capabilities, the vulnerabilities of Charleston's defenses. He even mentioned the peculiar behavior of Lieutenant Abernathy, the careless documents, the accidental absences, the strange journal with its coded messages. It was the mention of Abernathy that caused a stir among the Union officers. One of them, a stern-faced man named Major Thorne, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Abernathy, you say?" "Lieutenant Abernathy?" Robert confirmed, describing the man's gaunt features, his cynical demeanor, his unusual questions. Thorne exchanged a significant glance with another officer, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "We've had intelligence about a Confederate officer fitting that description," Thorne began, his voice low. "A man whose loyalty has been questioned, but we never had confirmation and certainly no direct contact." As Robert continued his debriefing, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a conspiracy far more intricate than Robert had ever imagined. The Union had indeed cultivated a network of informants within Charleston, desperate for any advantage against the heavily fortified city. Among them was a highly placed, albeit deeply embedded agent known only by the code name Sparrow. This agent's mission was to gather intelligence, but also, if the opportunity arose, to sow discord and create strategic vulnerabilities within the Confederate ranks. Major Thorne then revealed the shocking truth. Lieutenant Abernathy was Sparrow. He was a Union agent, a man who had infiltrated the Confederate command months earlier, playing a dangerous double game. His carelessness with documents, his accidental absences, his unintentional revelations of signal codes, all had been deliberate, meticulously calculated actions designed to facilitate the planter's escape. The map Robert had glimpsed on Abernathy's desk was a Union intelligence map, highlighting the very channels Abernathy intended Robert to use. The coded journal was Abernathy's personal log of his clandestine activities, a record of his perilous mission. The revelation hit Robert with a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude certainly for the unseen hand that had guided him and his family to freedom, but also a profound sense of unease, even anger. He had been a pawn, a crucial piece in a larger game. His heroic act of defiance subtly manipulated, his agency to some extent co-opted. His personal quest for freedom had been intertwined with a cold, calculated act of espionage. The thought was bitter, a challenge to his pride. He had believed his escape was a testament to his own ingenuity and courage. And, while it undeniably was, the knowledge that it had been facilitated, even orchestrated by an enemy agent, left a lingering, unsettling taste. Major Thorne explained the layers of the conspiracy. Abernathy's primary mission was intelligence gathering, but he had been given a secondary directive. If a suitable opportunity arose to deliver a Confederate vessel, particularly one with valuable intelligence, he was to facilitate it. Robert Smalls, with his intimate knowledge of the harbor and his undeniable skill, had been the perfect unwitting instrument. Abernathy had observed Robert's quiet determination, his meticulous attention to detail, and his burning desire for freedom. He had seen in Robert not just an enslaved man, but a potential asset, a man whose personal quest could be leveraged for strategic gain. The psychological impact on Robert was profound. He had achieved his freedom, a dream he had nurtured for a lifetime, but the knowledge that his journey had been, in part, a carefully constructed trap for the Confederacy, using him as bait, left him with a sense of being used. He was free, but the purity of his triumph was now tinged with the ambiguity of manipulation. Yet this revelation also solidified his resolve. He had been used, yes, but he had also used the opportunity. He had seized his freedom, and now he would fight for it on his own terms. He made a decision that day, standing on the deck of the Onward, Lou. King back at the distant, defiant shores of Charleston. He would not merely be a free man, he would be a fighter for freedom. He offered his services to the Union Navy, his unparalleled knowledge of the low country waterways, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to the cause of liberation. He would become a pilot, guiding Union ships through the very waters he had navigated in bondage, turning his intimate knowledge of the enemy's territory into a weapon against them. His military service would be marked by extraordinary bravery and invaluable contributions, a testament to his enduring spirit even in the face of the complex, shadowy truths of his own escape. The layers of the conspiracy, the true extent of Abernathy's network would remain largely hidden, a secret buried beneath the official narrative of a heroic escape, leaving Robert to grapple with the unsettling knowledge that his greatest triumph had been in part a carefully orchestrated dance with destiny. Robert Small's decision to serve the Union Navy was not merely an act of gratitude, but a profound declaration of his agency. He had been a pawn, perhaps, but he would now be a player, fighting for the freedom he had so audaciously seized. His knowledge of the intricate waterways of the South Carolina coast, particularly the treacherous channels around Charleston, proved invaluable. He became a pilot for the Union Navy, guiding ironclads and gunboats through Confederate minefields and past hidden batteries. His expertise saving countless Union lives and ships. He participated in numerous engagements, including the siege of Fort Sumter, a poignant full circle from the night he had sailed past its menacing guns. His courage under fire was legendary, earning him the respect of Union officers and sailors alike. He was a man transformed, no longer an enslaved wheelman, but a naval hero, a symbol of black bravery and ingenuity. After the war, with the dawn of Reconstruction, Robert Smalls returned to Buffett, a free man in a free land. His first act, a powerful symbol of his enduring spirit, was to purchase the very house where he and his mother had been, enslaved, the former residence of his master, Henry Mack Key. T was a defiant reclamation of his past, a physical manifestation of his hard-won freedom. He transformed it into a school for black children, a beacon of hope and education in a community striving to rebuild itself. His leadership and unwavering commitment to his community quickly propelled him into the political arena. He served in the South Carolina House of Representatives and Senate, advocating tirelessly for civil rights, public education, and economic opportunities for formerly enslaved people. In 1874, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, serving 5 non-consecutive terms. In the halls of Congress, the former slave who had stolen a warship now debated legislation, his voice, once silenced by bondage, now ringing with authority and purpose. Bar et against racial discrimination, championed universal suffrage, and worked to ensure that the promises of Reconstruction were not hollow words. Yet despite his public triumphs, the lingering mystery of Abernathy's role and the full extent of the conspiracy remained a quiet, persistent shadow in Robert's mind. Abernathy, the Union agent known as Sparrow, simply vanished after the planter's delivery. His name never appeared on any official Union combination list, nor was he ever publicly acknowledged for his role in the audacious escape. Was he reassigned to another deep cover mission? Did he disappear into the anonymity of post-war life? His identity forever erased to protect the secrets he carried? Or did he meet a darker fate, exposed and silenced by the very forces he sought to undermine? The unanswered questions hung in the air, a testament to the murky world of espionage, where heroes and villains often wore the same uniform. Robert in his later years would often sit on the porch of his Beaufort home, gazing out at the familiar waterways, the same tides that had carried him to freedom. He rarely spoke of Abernathy or the unsettling feeling of being a pawn in a larger game, but in the quiet solitude of his reflections, he undoubtedly wrestled with the ambiguity of that night. Was his escape a pure act of individual heroism, a testament to his own indomitable will, or was it a master stroke of espionage, a carefully orchestrated maneuver by unseen forces with his courage merely the catalyst? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a complex tapestry woven from extraordinary personal courage and the quiet calculations of forces hidden in the shadows. Robert Smalls's achievement cannot be overstated. In a single night, he transformed himself from property into legend, from an enslaved man into a living symbol of defiance and hope for millions. His actions sent shockwaves far beyond Charleston Harbor. They inspired countless enslaved people to believe that freedom was not only possible but attainable through intelligence, planning, and unbreakable resolve. Smalls shattered the racist myths of inferiority that underpinned slavery, proving beyond doubt that enslaved people possess not only courage but strategic brilliance and leadership under impossible pressure. And yet, one haunting question refuses to fade with time. Was it truly spontaneous, or was the planters' impossible journey more than a daring escape? Was it a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation with Robert Smalls, the skilled and fearless wheelman, positioned at its center, a man acting on his own genius, or a pivotal piece in a larger, unseen design? Even now, the salt-laced winds along the Carolina coast seem to whisper of that night, of shadows moving silently across the deck, of signals exchanged in darkness, of secrets carried across black water and buried deep within history itself. The past, like the dark depths of Charleston Harbor, does not reveal everything. It offers fragments, enough to inspire awe, enough to disturb, but leaves the rest submerged in speculation where truth and mystery blur. If this story made you question what you thought you knew about history, share it with someone who values the complexity of the past. And tell us in the comments, do you believe Robert Smalls was a lone genius who seized his moment, or was he part of something far larger, a hidden operation that history never fully recorded? Some stories end, others continue to echo,